Turning Point with Frank MacKay is brought to you by Atlantic Honda, New York's Auto Giant, and Herman Katz, Kanjimi and Klein, property tax attorneys and advisors.
The most interesting guests in the music industry, entertainment, art, and politics. Step into the studio for Turning Point with Frank MacKay.
This week on Turning Point with Frank MacKay, the founding member and the voice of the hit 70s band Orleans, Larry Hoppen is Frank's guest. This interview was recorded just prior to his passing on July 24th. Hoppen was the singer of such classic songs as Still the One, Dance With Me, Love Takes Time, and Let There Be Music.
Welcome to Turning Point. Our special guest today is Larry Hoppen. Larry is the founder, or one of the founders, of the band Orleans, and I'm sure people remember the hits that this band had. It was a string of hits, Larry, and you had quite a career, and you still having quite a career. How are you, Larry?
I'm good, thank you very much. Yeah, we're in our 40th year, and for those who don't know the name of the band, the hits were Still the One, Dance With Me, Love Takes Time, some other ones, and thankfully they're still very much on radio and commercials and whatever.
How many shows a year are you playing?
Oh, that varies. You know, we're going over to Japan to play July 4th this year, and we have all manner of different shows. We just played the Mohegan Sun Casino, and it would be anywhere from, 30 shows to 60 shows a year. Mostly
weekends are you doing?
Yeah, pretty much. It's on weekends, but a lot of the time, it'll start on Thursday or whatever.
Well, it's nice to have a life too, right? A life and wife and kids and everything else.
Balance is the key.
Yeah, you may not have thought that was going to be the case as you were going in the beginning. I'm sure it was a much different time, right? You're talking about the 70s. When did Orleans start?
72. And I started playing professionally in bands in the late '60s. But yeah, back then the world was very different, and of course we were very young, and that's what life's about. You go forward and you learn a lot, and your mindset and your the way of life changes.
Larry, let's go back before that. Did you grow up in New York?
Yes, I grew up on Long Island. I was born in Greenport, raised in Bayshore. Went to Brentwood schools, and then I left at 16 to go up to Ithaca College, and I only spent about a year and a half as a student of music education when I quit to become a performer.
And that's what you were going for? You wanted to be a music teacher, basically?
That's what I thought. I was only 16, and I don't think when you're 16 you have a very clear idea of what you want to do. Well,
you started college at 16. Is that because you finished earlier, or did you get into some kind of program?
No, when I spent 3 days in kindergarten, they put me right in the first grade, and then I did 4th, 5th, and 6th in 2 years. So. Oh wow. So I graduated early.
Yeah, well, that's impressive all its own. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be back with Larry Hoppen from Orleans.
Turning Point is brought to you by PC Wealth Management of Morgan Stanley Smith Barney and the law firm of Duffy & Duffy, protecting the victims of medical error. The Turning Point is brought to you by Smith DeGroat Real Estate, serving the tri-state area since 1955, and CAI, Insurance Solutions since 1961. On the web at www.conferenceny.com.
We're back. Our special guest again today is Larry Hoppen from the band Orleans. Larry, before the break, we discussed some of your upbringing, a very short part of it, but you ended up in Ithaca, and you mentioned for about a year and a half you were tentatively planning on being a music teacher. Let's go back between being born and going off to Ithaca. What happened in your high school years? Did you get into bands? Were you in high school bands, garage bands? What was the scenario?
Well, actually, it happened before high school. My parents were musicians. They met in the band in the 40s, and they always had music going on in the house, and they had jam sessions going on with other musicians that they knew and performed with. And my mom had a club band, and there was just that was the atmosphere. And so to me, that was totally normal growing up. I started playing trumpet when I was 8. by the time I was 12, well, my parents had gotten me a ukulele for Christmas when I was 9, and that quickly morphed into a guitar. By the time I was 12, I started my first band with some good friends on the block, garage band, you know. And we played our first paid gig at a church. We got $5 a piece. And, you know, I just never stopped doing that. I just loved it so much. And I had a couple of different bands in high school. The one that was the busiest was called the Surfs, S-E-R-F-S. And
as opposed to the Lords and feudal system.
Yeah. So anyways, you know, by the time I graduated high school at 16, I went up to get the music education program with a major in trumpet, and the idea was to become a music teacher. I started a band, immediately when I was up at college, and that's really what I was into. And my heart just was not into the whole teaching thing, and I found it very too rigid and really, you know, I'm not a very good teacher. I'm much more interested in writing and singing and playing. And fortunately, you know, it sort of worked out. So I wouldn't recommend quitting college for most people, for most young people. I think it's probably more difficult to do, or I know it's a lot more difficult to do what I did now than it was then. The world is so different, and you know, the media is different, and so there are different ways to get your. If you have something you want to promote, you promote it a different way. But to me, you know, it was a particular time, and it was doable. And when we started up Orleans in 1972, we were able to make it happen.
How do you like the business aspect of it? You touched on it a little bit there, and how different it is promotionally, and how it was back then. Do you like the business end?
Well, it's a necessary part of. I mean, I believe that you know you need to have a certain level of knowledge so that you don't just get taken advantage of any more than the next guy, because everybody gets taken advantage of in the music business when you're talking about the corporate labels and all of that. It's a tough road to navigate, and so you have to know quite a bit about how the industry works. Do I like it? You know, I don't care. I don't care for dealing with the labels and all that stuff. It's difficult, and it's very challenging. But that's why they call it work. You know, it's not all. I mean, when you see a performer up on stage, that's the fun part. That's the fun part, and that, you know, I always have said, well, I don't get paid to get on stage. I get paid to do everything else, to travel, you know, and to stay in hotels and be places where I'm just in for a day and out, and you know, that's why they call it work.
Did you find the trumpet helped you with your stamina as far as vocals go?
Absolutely. My breathing that I learned, you know, very young, you know, when I was 8 and 9 and 10, and all through school, has to this day. I'm 61, and I still, you know, I breathe the correct way, and I have good training that way. So it's been very, very helpful for singing, and that's true of all of us in Orleans, because we were all, you know, we all play classical instruments. We all had the same kind of band and choir and orchestra upbringing, and it's very, very helpful. When
was the last time you picked up the trumpet?
Well, I play a little trumpet in every show. So,
you do?
You know, I try to keep it current. Although, you know, to play a brass instrument really well, you have to play it a lot every day, and I don't do that. So, but the last time I picked it up was, a couple of weeks ago.
We're going to take a quick break on that note, and we'll be right back with Larry Hoppen from Orleans.
Turning Point with Frank MacKay is brought to you by Atlantic Honda, New York's Auto Giant, and Herman Katz, Kangemi & Klein, property tax attorneys and advisors. Turning Point is brought to you by PC Wealth Management of Morgan Stanley Smith Barney and the law firm of Duffy & Duffy, protecting the victims of medical error.
And we're back. Again, our special guest is Larry Hoppen, the lead singer and the founder of Orleans. Let's talk a little of the founding of Orleans and what were you doing right prior to that, and maybe you can tell us the history. Give us the history of Orleans.
Yeah, I'm actually a co-founder. When I was up in Ithaca, after I left school, I stayed there for a number of years. I left school in early 1969 and stayed and joined a band called Bafalongo. And that band was, locally very popular. And we had a couple of guys, quote-unquote, managing us. And they managed to get us on a United Artists label. And we cut 2 records for United Artists, 2 albums. And we played the Fillmore and pretty interesting stuff. But the most notable thing about Bafalongo is that was the band that cut the very original version of the song Dancing in the Moonlight. Because the guy who wrote it, Sherman Kelly, was in the band with us, as was his younger brother, Wells Kelly, who became Orleans' drummer. And anyway, how that happened was towards the end of 1971, John Hall, who had been playing with Taj Mahal and also did some sessions and wound up on the Seals and Crofts debut album, which was very, big hit, and a bunch of other sessions down in New York City. I had met John at a jam session one night in New York City. I went over there with Wells and, no, I didn't go over with Wells. I went over there with Doc Robinson, who was also in Bafalongo, who wound up, he was the bass player on the very original version that Bafalongo cut of Dancing in the Moonlight. But then he wound up later being the lead singer that everybody knows his voice from the hit version of Dancing in the Moonlight. Anyways, Doc and I went over to this jam session at a studio that our friend owned, and I walked in, and John Hall was playing guitar, Harvey Brooks was playing bass, Wells Kelly was playing drums, and they were in the middle of some jam on the song Age of Aquarius. Remember the big Fifth Dimension hit?
From Hair.
And I just simply picked up a guitar. They were in the middle of the song. I just picked up a guitar, and I started harmonizing with John, doing double guitar leads. And that was how we met. So a number of months, maybe a year went by, and I get a phone call from Wells. I get that wrong. So anyways, Wells announces at the end of 1971 that John Hall has moved up to Woodstock, New York. He and his wife were tired of getting their apartment broken into in New York. So they bought a house in Woodstock with the proceeds of the song Half Moon, which Janis Joplin had recorded and put on the B-side of her Me and Bobby McGee.
That's right.
So they made a lot of money on that. So they bought a house, and John wanted to know if Wells would come down and make a band with him. And Wells immediately quit the band that we were in late 71, December I think it was, and said he was going to Woodstock. Well, in February of 1972, just about a month later, John and Wells called me up, and they said, hey, there's 2 guys leaving in this band. Do you want to come down and we'll have a trio? And I said, sure. So I wound up moving to Woodstock, New York, stayed there for the next 28 years. The trio became Orleans, and 9 months into the trio, we decided to add my brother Lance, so that I had been playing bass. We wanted a bass player so that I could play more guitar and keyboards, and we could just get a bigger sound. And that's how the band was formed.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting tie in there. I knew there was a tie to Seals and Crofts somehow. I didn't know exactly what it was, but it was John Hall.
Well, yeah, John Hall played a lot of guitar on their debut record, which I think was called Down Home or something. But anyway, Sherman Kelly and Doc, they're still friends of mine, And very recently, about a month ago, down here in Florida, we all got together, and John Hall, Lance, myself, and our drummer, Charlie Morgan, re-recorded very authentic sound-alikes of all the Orleans hits, plus Dancing in the Moonlight. So, some 40 years later, we've just re-recorded those songs the way they were done originally, and they came out great. So it's really it's a long and winding road, but we're still all in the same circle of friends, and that's kind of interesting.
Well, yeah, it certainly is, and you're going strong after 40 years. I mean, you still have good crowds, and you're playing all types of crowds. But you've always had mass appeal, and I think because of that, people may lose the idea that it was still the early 70s, and it was right in the middle of, I'm sure, all kinds of Vietnam protests and drugs obviously was an issue.
Oh yeah,
and women.
It was Vietnam, it was Watergate, it was Nixon, all of that.
A band like Orleans is sometimes overlooked when it comes to some of the controversy over the issues of the area, because you really weren't a controversial band, but you did get political.
Very. We're known for the hits, obviously. That most, millions of people know us for "Dance with Me" and "Still the One" and "Love Takes Time" and like that. But if you look at the albums and the material that's on them, there are a lot of songs. There's a song called "Cold Spell," which was basically talking about oil shortages and fossil fuel and the problems we're going to run into 40 years ago. And not a lot has changed, except that it's a bigger problem than it was then. And there were songs about all manner of social and political issues. And that's what we used to talk about in the dressing room. I mean, we just talked about the issues of the day. And that's the way it was the whole time that we were together in the 70s, and still today. That's what we talk about. And, of course, you see that John Hall, we were all politically involved and still are, but John Hall was more so than the rest of us. I mean, and he wound up spearheading the No Nukes concerts, and, of course, he became a congressman and served 2 terms very recently.
You're from in the Westchester area, Westchester, Putnam, and he beat Sue Kelly, a popular incumbent at the time.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and it certainly says a lot, and it says a lot for the popularity of the band. And
well, I don't know that. I think Orleans helped him. I mean, the fact that he was from Orleans helped him, and I went up and sang and performed at one of his fundraisers at Town Hall in Manhattan with Jackson Browne and Roseanne Cash and Steve Earle and a bunch of other people. But, John managed to get a lot of groundswell support in his own district. He had like 12 or 1,400 people working for him, his election. And he also had people like Bonnie Raitt and Crosby, Stills and Nash come in and do fundraising concerts. So, he definitely had some musical people behind him.
Well, you know what it also does is it gives the writers a catchphrase or a starting point, and it's a separate story, and
yes.
It defines who the candidate is by saying, look, there's some more depth here. He was the singer in Orleans, or he was the guitarist rather in Orleans, and he's a co-founder. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that certainly ties into a lot of folks. Just like Steve Largent in Congress now. I mean, he's
right.
A former wide receiver from the Seattle Seahawks, and something like that is at least a tag at the bottom of a page.
Well, familiarity and name recognition is important, and of course, if you like Orleans music or you like Steve Largent's football career, then that's very helpful.
Also, it plays to the fact that you could still get mass appeal because your songs are still being played. I mean, I'm sure you see that in royalty checks. Your songs are still widely played, and just every day, somewhere, somehow, on radio stations in every market, you can hear Orleans. and that's a nice thing for you guys.
It's a good thing. It definitely is very helpful, and it's a big reason why we still are able to do shows and make a living doing that. And it's kind of worldwide. I mean, we've been over to Japan a few times and a lot of other places, and I'm very grateful for it because I wouldn't have been able to see as much of the world without all that.
People that are listening to this outside of New York should not mistake Brentwood, New York for Brentwood, California.
It's correct.
There's certainly a disparity between the two Brentwoods. Brentwood, New York, for those who don't know, is a very modest, integrated area. I mean, it's a racially mixed area, and it's a great district. But it's diverse and it has its issues. But certainly, you don't think of somebody coming from Brentwood, New York, as being affluent.
Right, and that's where I went to school, because we were although we lived in Bayshore, the way that they divided up the school districts, we wound up on just that side of the line,
Yeah.
And that's where I went to school, and it was a very good school system back in the '60s.
Do you remember your first big check?
Yes, I do.
You do, and it came from Orleans, or did it come from the band prior?
No, it came from having written the hit song "Love Takes Time."
Yeah. Oh, so that was the first. That was your first big break.
That was the first big hit that I wrote.
Yeah.
I sang and played a lot of the instruments on "Still the One and Dance with Me," but I did not write them. John Hall and his ex-wife wrote them. So the big checks for that went to them, but the big checks for "Love Takes Time" went to me.
Still a big hit, still out there, and I hate to call it oldies stations, but classic rock and
yeah.
And certainly I guess people would call it oldies now, but it's still a big song, a great song. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back with Larry Hoppen. We're going to talk more about the business and talk more about Orleans. We'll be back.
The Turning Point is brought to you by Smith DeGroat Real Estate, serving the tri-state area since 1955, and CAI, Insurance Solutions since 1961. On the web at www.conferenceny.com. Turning Point is brought to you by PC Wealth Management of Morgan Stanley Smith Barney and the law firm of Duffy & Duffy, protecting the victims of medical error.
We are back with Larry Hoppen, one of the co-founders of Orleans, very successful band for 40 years now and still going strong. Larry, going back to early Orleans, let's talk about the record deal and how you got to the point of your prior band and getting into Orleans. We didn't actually touch on that. You did mention that your original managers from the other band got a deal for you with United Artists, which isn't a bad job.
Well, no, I mean, but we never saw any money from them. The records didn't really get promoted; they didn't really sell, and even with "Dancing in the Moonlight," that was not the hit version. So that was kind of an introduction into the reality that just because you get a contract doesn't mean you're going to be successful. A record contract does not equal success.
No, but it does get the ball rolling.
It does. It gets your foot in the door. When that band was over and we started on the Orleans path, what happened was we showcased in New York City quite a lot to get our first record deal, which became we became signed to ABC Records back then, and we made our first album in Muscle Shoals, which we were thrilled about because that's a legendary place.
Alabama?
Aretha Franklin and Wilson Pickett, and just a whole long list of incredible R&B performers. Plus, Paul Simon made his Kodachrome album there, his debut solo album, and a lot of other people. And I remember back then when we were recording and it rained, we had to stop because it had a tin roof. And the rain was really loud.
No kidding. Oh,
I'm sure they've fixed that by now.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, we made that album, and the first album, and it was very critically acclaimed, and is our diehard fans' favorite album to this day. And we made it in 2 weeks, and it's just really fast, and it went really well. And it wasn't particularly polished, but I think that's what people like about it. And then we made a second album up in Woodstock where we lived, and we self-produced it. And even though it had the original versions of Let There Be Music and Dance With Me on that album, ABC Records dropped us from the label. They didn't hear, quote unquote, they didn't hear any hits. So we started showcasing in New York City again. And this was like 1974 at this point. And the last night of a long engagement at Max's Kansas City, a guy named Chuck Plotkin was in the audience, and he liked what he heard. And long story short, he had just been signed by David Geffen to be David Geffen's A&R guy at Asylum Records. And Asylum Records was the place to be. They had the Eagles, they had Joni Mitchell, they had Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, and a long list of people we really wanted to be associated with. So Chuck, anyway, he heard us and he signed us, and he had the foresight to get re-recording rights to Let There Be Music and Dance With Me. And we went into the studio, and he turned Dance With Me into a hit record with his production skills. And the next album we made, which was in 1976, Let There Be Music album came out in 1975. We recorded the Waking and Dreaming album. That's the one with the famous cover where we don't have any shirts on.
Right.
Yeah, right. Just, no such thing as bad press, right?
That was iconic. That was an iconic shot.
So anyways, that had Still the One, and that came out in August of 76 and was just a rocket ship. And, we were out on tour with Jackson Browne for about 2.5 months, riding the success of Still the One. And, of course, Dance With Me from the prior year. But anyways, long story short, go forward a few years, and Chuck Plotkin wound up being Bruce Springsteen's producer for the really, really meat and potatoes of Bruce's recording success, like Born on 4th of
Born in the USA.
July. Born in the USA, sorry,
right.
Yeah. Born in the USA, and, all the big singles, Dancing in the Dark,
Cover Me, right? Cover Me was in there.
Cover Me, all that stuff.
Sure.
Chuck was he really was great that way. So it wasn't a fluke that we had some hit records with Chuck Plotkin, because he knows how to do that. I'm having trouble talking.
Yeah. Well, Larry, let's jump back to the ABC contract and getting dropped there. Who was the decision maker on that?
Oh my goodness, I don't really remember.
ABC had some pretty big artists, right? Did they have?
Well, we came out. Our album, our first album, I think, came out in the same release batch with dozens of other artists, and two of them were the first Steely Dan album and the first Rufus record with Chaka Khan.
Yeah.
And so they just throw the stuff up against the wall and they see what sticks. And, of course, Steely Dan and Rufus stuck, and they basically dropped everybody else.
They used to have a 3 out of 7 rule, a lot of labels, and they'd push three bands, and they'd sign 7, and then hopefully those 3 bands would cover up for losses of the 4.
Pretty much, that's the way they used to do it. And, it's an exasperating system, but that was the system.
What was the turning point in your career?
In my career? Because, I was going to say that a major turning point in my life was when I decided to leave college to become a professional and make my life as a recording and performing musician. That was it was a huge risk, and it was a big turning point, obviously. But in terms of the turning point of my career, well, I think another one would be this. After the success of Dance With Me and Still the One, John Hall decided to leave the band and go solo. So he did that, and I had a huge choice to make. I had to decide whether I got some offers. One of them was from Todd Rundgren. You know, he lived in Woodstock, was kind of a neighbor.
Bearsville, right? Bearsville Records.
Yeah. And Todd had a band, and the bass player, Kazim Sultan, had left. And so the drummer, Willie Wilcox, invited me to try out for the band. So I went over to see Todd, and, I passed the audition, and I got invited to be in Todd's band. And so my choice was, well, do I continue on and go forward with Orleans and run, and basically try to run that and make it successful without John? Or do I go work with Todd Rundgren, who's, fairly, he's getting established, and more than getting established.
Was that pre-Meatloaf or was that after Meatloaf?
This was 1977. So I think it was pre-Meatloaf.
Yeah.
And I thought about it, long and hard, and I just decided that I wanted to continue Orleans, and I wanted to see if I could do it, see if I could make it work. And long story short, we got another record deal after we reformed the band as a 5-piece with a few other people. Still my brother Lance and Wells Kelly, the original drummer. So the three originals plus 2 other guys, Bob Lineback and R.A. Martin, who I'm also still friends with today. We went forward, we got a record deal, and the first single that was released was Love Takes Time, and it was also a huge hit. So that was very validating, and, that was a huge choice that I made and a huge turning point, because so many people in the industry were saying, oh, they're not going to be anything without John Hall. They're not going to be able to do it, blah, blah, blah. And, that's, that I wanted to prove everybody wrong, and I wanted to prove it to myself most of all.
Right. You certainly did with that song. It still holds up to this day. We're going to take a break at that point, and when we come back with Larry Hoppen from Orleans, we are going to ask him what's next.
Turning Point with Frank MacKay is brought to you by Atlantic Honda, New York's Auto Giant, and Herman Katz, Kangemi and Klein, property tax attorneys and advisors. Turning Point is brought to you by PC Wealth Management of Morgan Stanley Smith Barney and the law firm of Duffy & Duffy, protecting the victims of medical error.
We are back. Again, our special guest, a very special guest, has been Larry Hoppen from the band Orleans. And Larry, you've had quite a career, and it's still going. What do you do from here?
Well, we don't always know what's coming next, but things happen, and like I said, we're going over to play for the troops at Misawa Air Force Base in Japan, for one thing, for July 4th this year, and that's exciting. And we try to stay current, and we are recording. Like I said, we just did some authentic sound-alike re-records of the hits. Plus, we've been recording some new songs. And, I'm not sure if I'm not sure how we'll package these, if we'll just put them up on iTunes or we'll make CDs or do both or whatever.
Where do people get information on you?
We have a website. It's called OrleansOnline.com. So, www.orleansonline.com. We're also on Facebook as Orleans Band. But the thing is, the website is really pretty robust. I mean, it has a lot of history, has a lot of video and music. You can buy stuff there. You can just sort of see what we're about. There's just a lot there, and it's fun, and we've been going for 40 years, so there's a lot of stuff.
Do you know your statistics? In other words, how many records you sold, how many albums you sold, that type of thing?
We don't really know that. We can make wild guesses. I don't believe the record companies. They tell you sold X.
Right.
Like we never got a gold record from the label for Still the One.
That's amazing. I think of that as your signature song.
Well, I'm pretty sure that 1 million people bought that CD. that single.
Yeah.
But the record company told us that we sold 900,000 or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing.
Right.
So
you're a cynic. You're a cynic when it comes to the business.
I'm not a cynic. I'm making an educated guess.
Yeah. Right.
And as far as the air, we do know that we've gotten well over 7 million plays between the three hits. Still the one that's gotten the most. It's kind of like, I think it's about 4 million plays. But, I mean, these figures are 5 years old, so who knows? You know?
You'd have a right to be a little cynical. You grew up in the era where, and you succeeded in the era where it was much looser, and I think the artist had much less control. I mean, certainly more than they had in the 50s and the early 60s, but still in the 70s, you didn't have the great control that the labels did. Nowadays, certainly the stars, more or less run the show once they're stars. But
that's true all the time. The difference now, or one of the differences now, is the labels don't have as much power because a lot of artists who are smart are doing a lot of what the labels used to do on their own, rather than get caught up with a label that's going to basically get between you and your money.
Right.
What I see that I find fairly distressing is the labels offer what's called a 360 deal, what that means basically is that they're going to take a piece of, or a significant piece of every single aspect of your career in return for funding the promotion of your career. That means they're going to take not just your record royalties, the bulk of them, but that means they're going to take
merchandising,
touring money, merchandise money, publishing money. It's just, and that's a really, really heavy price to pay over a lifetime.
If you had to give a young, aspiring artist, and again, it's a much different time. You've been at it for 40 years. If you had to sum up some advice, what would you tell them?
I would say, try to do as much. Well, first of all, try to educate yourself about how the business actually works. Don't leave it up to somebody else entirely, because that puts you at a severe disadvantage. People need to know as much as they possibly can about the business that they're in.
Right.
And not just be, the flaky artist, as it were, who just worries about the music, because people take advantage of that. And that's why one of the big reasons why artists get signed young, because when they're young, they're more naive, and it's easier to take advantage of you. So unless you have a really good lawyer, or you need people who are going to look out for you. So it's important to make friends. It's important to be able to develop a sense of who's what I call a keeper friend, and who's not. And these are all, these are intangibles. But I found in my life and career that it's the people who are the keepers that you want to nurture, and those relationships will serve both you and the other person very well over a very long period of time, and keep you out of a lot of trouble. And don't sign anything. That's a big one. Don't sign anything.
Sometimes that can't be avoided, but that is great advice. And Larry, on that note, we're going to end. And we loved having you here, and hopefully we can have you in the future and talk some more. Larry Hoppen from Orleans.
Thanks a lot, Frank. My pleasure.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for listening. We'll be back next week on Turning Point.
Turning Point with Frank MacKay is brought to you by Herman Katz, Jenny and Klein, Duffy & Duffy, and Gold Coast Bank.
Turning Point with Frank MacKay was produced by Out of the Box Studios in Bohemia, New York. Executive producers Frank MacKay and Harry Oates. Director of Operations Corey Arnold. Audio and studio engineering Francis Kazmarek. And James DeZigo of Sage Studios. Webmaster Eric Stoll. Radio segment producer James DeZigo. Hotel and accommodations provided by Ohiga Castle Hotel and Estates in Huntington, New York. Transportation services provided by Mark of Elegance Limousine in Hauppauge, New York. Catering services provided by Windows on the Lake in Ronkonkoma, New York.